For over a century, one word has haunted the deserts of the American Southwest: vanished. Textbooks called them the Anasazi, a name borrowed from a Navajo word that roughly translates to ancient enemies. And they told you this civilization built stone cities in the cliffs, raised sandstone towers taller than anything else in North America at the time, engineered roads that ran arrow straight for miles across canyon country, and then, in the space of a single generation, disappeared. No war, no plague on record, no mass grave. Just empty rooms, cold hearths, and a silence that archaeologists have spent 100 years trying to explain. Every documentary you've ever watched about the Southwest leans on that mystery. Every museum placard hints at abandonment, collapse, a people erased by drought or violence or something we still don't understand. But in the spring of 2025, a team of geneticists working inside a sealed, clean lab in Copenhagen extracted DNA from human bone and tooth fragments smaller than a fingernail clipping, compared them against genetic data from over 5,000 people across the planet, and delivered a result that quietly dismantles the entire premise of the vanishing myth. The Anasazi did not disappear, they never left. And the proof isn't buried in some newly unearthed tomb. It's alive today, breathing, walking, telling stories in a village of fewer than 300 people in northern New Mexico. That village is Pueblo. If you've never heard of it, that's part of the story. Picuris is one of 19 Pueblo communities still standing in New Mexico, tucked into a high valley beneath the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And for centuries, its people have told a very specific oral history. They say their ancestors came from Chaco Canyon, the extraordinary complex of multi-story stone buildings, ceremonial kivas, and arrow straight roads that once functioned as the political and spiritual center of the entire ancestral Puebloan world. Outsiders have called Chaco a lost civilization for generations, comparing it in the same breath to Stonehenge or the abandoned temples of Angkor. To understand why that comparison is so misleading, it helps to understand just how advanced Chaco actually was. At its height, roughly between 850 and 1150 AD, Chaco Canyon functioned as the ceremonial and administrative heart of a network stretching across tens of thousands of square miles of the Colorado Plateau. Pueblo Bonito alone, the largest of the canyon's great houses, contained hundreds of rooms stacked up to 4 stories high, built with core and veneer masonry techniques that required an enormous, coordinated labor force and a level of architectural planning that still impresses structural engineers today. Some buildings were aligned with such precision to solar and lunar cycles that archaeoastronomers have spent decades mapping the deliberate relationships between doorways, windows, and the movement of the sun across the canyon walls. Radiating outward from the canyon, ancient roads up to 30 feet wide ran in perfectly straight lines for dozens of miles, cutting through terrain rather than curving around it, connecting outlying communities back to the ceremonial center in a way that suggests centralized planning on a scale historians once assumed didn't exist north of Mexico before European contact. But the people of Picuris never accepted that framing because, in their tradition, nothing about Chaco was lost. Their grandparents told them their grandparents came from there. It was migration, not extinction. For decades, that oral history was treated by mainstream science the way most indigenous oral histories have been treated in the United States, as folklore, as tradition worth respecting in a ceremonial sense, but not as evidence, not as data, not as something a court, a federal agency, or an academic journal would take seriously when it came to deciding who actually has a claim to sacred land. That dismissal has real consequences, and it's why this story matters far beyond a genetics lab. Chaco Canyon today sits at the center of an active political fight. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, protected on paper, but the land surrounding it has been targeted for oil and gas drilling, and the indigenous communities who consider it ancestral ground have repeatedly found themselves shut out of the decisions being made about its future. Picuris leaders, including Lieutenant Governor Craig Quancello, have described their community's traditions and concerns as overlooked and erased by the very government agencies responsible for managing the land. So a few years ago, Picuris Pueblo made an unusual decision. Instead of waiting for outsiders to validate their history or continuing to watch their oral traditions get quietly dismissed in bureaucratic hearings, tribal leadership decided to pursue something almost no other federally recognized tribe in American history had done. They initiated their own genetic study on their own terms to test whether the science would back up what they had always known. This is the detail that changes everything about how you should understand this research. It wasn't scientists showing up to study indigenous people. It was indigenous people directing scientists to answer a question that mattered to them. The tribe partnered with a team led by geneticist Thomas Pinati and archaeologist J. Victor Moreno Mayar, working alongside the renowned evolutionary geneticist S.K. Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen's Globe Institute, one of the most respected ancient DNA facilities on the planet. But the terms of the collaboration were set by Picuris, not by the university. The tribe retained control over every stage of the project. They decided which remains could be sampled and which could not. They controlled the interpretation of the results, and critically, they held veto power over publication itself. If the findings had contradicted tribal tradition, or if the community had simply changed its mind partway through, the entire study could have been shut down and the data destroyed. As lead author Pinati later put it, the Pueblo Committee held the power to stop the project at any moment, and at the end of every single meeting, that committee reaffirmed its willingness to continue. This is a radically different model from the genetic research the Southwest has seen before, and that history matters, because it's the reason many indigenous communities have been reluctant to participate in ancient DNA studies at all. Back in 2017, researchers published genetic data pulled from remains at Pueblo Bonito, the largest of Chaco Canyon's great houses, without adequately consulting the indigenous communities connected to that site, and the backlash was significant. Trust, once broken in this field, is difficult to rebuild. Pueblo Pueblo's leadership went into this project fully aware of that history, which is exactly why they insisted on writing the rules themselves. Before any of the lab work began, there was the matter of choosing who to trust with something this sensitive. Eske Willerslev isn't a random name attached to a press release. He's one of the most cited evolutionary geneticists alive, known for landmark studies on the peopling of the Americas, the genetic history of indigenous Australians, and the sequencing of some of the oldest human and animal DNA ever recovered anywhere on Earth. Bringing a researcher of that caliber into a project doesn't happen by accident, and it wasn't his team that initiated contact. It was Pueblo's leadership who sought out collaborators capable of producing results that could withstand the scrutiny of a journal like Nature, one of the most rigorously peer-reviewed publications in all of science, precisely because they understood that if this study was going to be used to argue for protection of ancestral land, it needed to be unimpeachable. Anything less than airtight methodology risked being dismissed the same way oral tradition alone had been dismissed for generations. Inside the Globe Institute's dedicated ancient DNA clean labs, researchers worked with astonishingly small material. Each sample of bone or tooth used in the extraction process was less than 1/20th of a teaspoon in volume. From those microscopic fragments, the team successfully generated full genomes from 16 ancient individuals who had been buried at or near Pueblo, spanning roughly the years 1300 to 1500 AD, a period that places them squarely within the centuries following the depopulation of Chaco Canyon itself. Alongside the ancient genomes, 13 living members of the Pueblo community voluntarily donated saliva samples, allowing researchers to sequence present-day DNA and place it directly alongside the genetic record of people who lived 5 to 7 centuries earlier. Then came the comparison stage, and this is where the scale of the study becomes genuinely staggering. The Pueblo's genetic data wasn't just measured against a handful of regional samples, it was evaluated against reference datasets drawn from roughly 300 populations across the Americas and more than 5,500 individuals worldwide, one of the broadest comparative frameworks ever applied to a study of this kind. The result, published in the journal Nature on April 30th, 2025, was unambiguous. Among every population sampled, ancient or modern, none showed a closer genetic relationship to the ancient inhabitants of Chaco Canyon than the people of Pueblo, past and present. Not close, not similar. Closest, full stop, out of thousands of comparison points spanning an entire hemisphere. The ancient individuals buried at Pueblo between 1300 and 1500 AD were found to share a strong, direct genetic relationship with the 13 living tribal members who donated samples for the study, meaning the biological lineage connecting the builders of Chaco-era communities to the people living in that valley today isn't symbolic, isn't cultural inheritance in some loose metaphorical sense. It's a continuous, traceable line of descent. Pinati described the finding plainly. The results show a strong relationship between ancient and present-day Pueblos. Researchers also identified something that added an extra layer of specificity to the connection. Individuals from Chaco Canyon and the Pueblo's lineage were found to share unusually rare genetic markers, the kind of subtle biological fingerprints that don't show up by coincidence across unrelated populations. That detail is part of why the researchers describe this as the strongest genetic connection yet established between any present-day community and the ancient people of Chaco Canyon. For Pueblo's Governor Wayne Yaza, who co-authored the study alongside the scientific team, the emotional weight of that result was not subtle. He described the decision to begin working with outside geneticists as one that wasn't easy, given everything indigenous communities have historically had to be wary of when it comes to institutional research. But once the data came back, he called it life-changing. Quancello, reflecting on generations of oral tradition finally meeting hard genetic confirmation, put it even more directly. We've been telling our story since time immemorial, and now science is catching up. That single sentence captures the entire reframing this study demands. This was never a discovery in the sense of scientists uncovering something the Piqueres people didn't already know. It was a confirmation, arriving 500 years late, of something the community had been saying the entire time, passed down through ceremony, through song, through generations who never had access to a peer-reviewed journal but never needed one to know exactly where they came from. It's worth being precise here about what this study does and does not claim, because overstating it would be its own kind of disservice to the science. The research does not argue that every Pueblo community descends from Chaco Canyon in the same measurable way, and the team was explicit that their sampling was limited. No other Pueblo communities were included in the genetic comparison, meaning this study establishes an unusually strong and specific link for Piqueres Pueblo without ruling out ancestral connections that other Pueblo nations may also hold to the same region. There are 19 federally recognized Pueblo tribes in New Mexico today, many of which maintain their own oral traditions, tying them to Chaco Canyon's deep past. And this study doesn't erase or compete with those claims. As the researchers themselves stated, the new findings do not refute the historic connections other tribes maintain to the site. What the study does establish, with unusual scientific weight, is that at minimum, one direct, unbroken genetic thread runs from the people who built and inhabited the great houses of Chaco Canyon straight through to a living, federally recognized community occupying ancestral land in New Mexico right now in 2026. That distinction is exactly why archaeologist Paul Reed of Archaeology Southwest, who wasn't involved in the study, pushed back hard on the framing that dominates so much popular media about this region. He put it bluntly, it's super important that we don't talk about Chaco in the category of lost civilizations, the way people casually reference the Egyptian pyramids or Stonehenge. Those comparisons imply a culture with no living descendants, no continuing voice, nothing left but stone and speculation. Chaco Canyon has never fit that description, and this study is the clearest scientific rebuttal yet to the idea that it does. The people who engineered those roads, aligned those buildings to solstice light, and organized a civilization spanning the Four Corners region didn't vanish into myth. Their direct descendants can be found today at Piqueres Pueblo, and almost certainly across other Pueblo communities whose own ancestral claims to the region remain, for now, scientifically untested, but far from disproven. This isn't the first time genetic evidence has quietly chipped away at the vanishing narrative either. Back in 2017, a very different research team took an unconventional approach to the same mystery, extracting mitochondrial DNA not from human remains, but from the bones of domesticated turkeys, which the ancestral Puebloans raised in significant numbers at settlements like Mesa Verde. The logic was elegant. Turkeys don't migrate on their own, so if a population moved, their turkeys moved with them. Researchers compared the maternal genetic lineage of turkeys from Mesa Verde against turkey populations from the northern Rio Grande region, sampling material from both before and after the ancestral Puebloans left Mesa Verde around 1280 AD. Before that date, the two turkey populations were genetically distinct with no meaningful maternal overlap. But after 1280, the northern Rio Grande turkeys suddenly carried Mesa Verde haplogroups, the genetic clusters specific to birds raised at the abandoned settlement. The most plausible explanation, published in the journal PLOS One, was that the people of Mesa Verde didn't die out or dissolve into nothing. They packed up, migrated south and east toward the Rio Grande Valley, and brought their livestock with them. It's a smaller, quieter piece of evidence than the 2025 Piqueres study, and some researchers, including anthropologist R.G. Matson of the University of British Columbia, considered the turkey evidence intriguing but comparatively weak on its own. Still, it pointed in the exact same direction the human genetic data would confirm 8 years later. Migration, not disappearance. Put those two studies side by side and a much clearer picture emerges of what actually happened in the Four Corners region roughly 7 centuries ago. Around the late 1200s, prolonged drought, resource pressure, and social upheaval pushed communities across the Colorado Plateau to abandon major settlements like Mesa Verde and the great houses of Chaco Canyon, which had already been in decline for generations by that point. Tree ring records reconstructed from ancient timber beams pulled out of southwestern great houses have allowed climatologists to map rainfall patterns across the region with startling precision, and those records point to what's often called the Great Drought, a period stretching from roughly 1276 to 1299 AD, during which rainfall across the Four Corners dropped sharply and stayed low for over 2 decades. For a population dependent on dry land maize farming in an already marginal environment, 2 decades of failed or diminished harvests wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was an existential threat, and it arrived on top of other pressures archaeologists have identified in the material record, including evidence of resource competition, shifting alliances, and periods of localized conflict between communities competing for increasingly scarce farmland and water sources. Faced with that combination of stressors, staying in place stopped being a viable option for many communities across the region. But abandonment of a location is not the same as extinction of a people. The ancestral Puebloans didn't scatter into nothing. They consolidated, migrated toward reliable water sources along the Rio Grande and its tributaries, and founded or expanded the villages that would eventually become the Pueblo communities recognized by the federal government today, Picuris among them. What looked to outside observers, and later to generations of archaeologists working without genetic tools, like a civilization vanishing into thin air, was in reality a civilization relocating, adapting, and continuing under new names and new places. The word Anasazi itself is part of the reason this myth persisted as long as it did. That term isn't even the choice of the people it describes. It comes from a Navajo word generally translated as ancient enemies or ancient ones who are not us, a label applied from the outside by a different indigenous nation, and then adopted uncritically by generations of American archaeologists and textbook publishers. The people, whose descendants live at Picuris, at Acoma, at Zuni, and across the other Pueblo nations of the Southwest, have their own names for their ancestors, rooted in their own languages and traditions, and the scientific and archaeological community has increasingly shifted toward using the term Ancestral Puebloan specifically because it doesn't carry that borrowed, othering weight. There's also a legal and political dimension to this discovery that deserves attention, because it's the reason the Picuris community pursued this research in the first place. Genetic confirmation of ancestral ties that doesn't automatically translate into legal protection. Brian Vallow, a member of Acoma Pueblo who leads the Chaco Heritage Tribal Association, noted that current concerns center on drilling and mining permits being considered on federal land directly adjacent to the park. Land that isn't protected by the same UNESCO designation as the core site, but still affects the broader landscape Chaco was always part of. Vallow, who wasn't involved in the genetic study, pointed out that Pueblo communities didn't need DNA evidence to know their ancestors built and migrated through these places. But he also acknowledged that this kind of scientific validation carries weight in rooms where oral tradition alone has historically been dismissed. Other advocates for indigenous data sovereignty have raised a more cautious note. Proving genetic lineage to ancient burial sites doesn't guarantee that United States courts will recognize or grant land rights on that basis. There's ongoing legal precedent involving other tribes, including the Tap, Palam, Coahuiltecan nations' long struggle to secure protection for ancestral burial grounds located beneath a site as significant as the Alamo, showing just how difficult it remains for indigenous communities to translate ancestral connection, even well-documented ancestral connection, into enforceable legal protection. So while the Picuris findings are being framed by tribal leadership as a potential tool for strengthening their position in ongoing negotiations over Chaco's future, nobody involved is describing it as a guaranteed legal victory. It's evidence, powerful, historic evidence. But the fight over who gets a formal voice in protecting that land is far from finished. What makes this story worth telling isn't just the genetics, though the genetics alone would be remarkable. It's the reversal of who gets to hold authority over their own history. For most of the 20th century, the story of the ancestral Puebloans was written almost entirely by outside archaeologists, museum curators, and later documentary producers, often with little to no input from the descendant communities whose ancestors were being dug up, cataloged, and displayed. Indigenous oral tradition was treated as color commentary at best, dismissed as unreliable myth at worst. The Picuris-led study inverts that entire dynamic. Here, a community with roughly 300 living members didn't wait for permission from the academic establishment to tell their own history. They brought in scientists as collaborators, not as authorities, kept full control over the data at every stage, and used the resulting evidence to formally validate what their oral tradition had insisted upon for as long as anyone could remember. Thomas Pinotti, reflecting on the broader implications of the work, noted that the research team remains open to collaborating with other tribes interested in similar genetic studies of their own ancestry. But he was equally candid that many communities remain hesitant, and understandably so, given the long history of scientific research being conducted on indigenous remains and DNA without meaningful consent or community control. It's also worth pointing out that the Anasazi vanishing myth has never existed in isolation. It belongs to a much larger, much older pattern in how Western archaeology and popular media have historically framed indigenous civilizations across the Americas, treating them as static ruins to be marveled at, rather than as ancestors of people still living next door. The Maya were declared a vanished civilization for generations, despite millions of Maya people speaking Mayan languages across Mexico and Central America to this day. The Cahokia mound builders of the Mississippi River Valley were long framed as a mystery culture with no clear descendants, a framing many archaeologists now consider deeply flawed and disconnected from the region's actual indigenous history. The Picuri study matters partly because it offers a rare, rigorously peer-reviewed template for dismantling that pattern with hard genetic evidence rather than argument alone, and it's likely to influence how similar questions get investigated elsewhere. Panatti and his colleagues have said openly that they're willing to work with other tribes who want to pursue the same kind of research, provided it happens on terms the communities themselves control. And given how many other Pueblo nations maintain their own oral histories connecting them to Chaco Canyon, it wouldn't be surprising if Picurus Pueblo's decision to go public with this data prompts other communities to reconsider whether a similar study could strengthen their own standing in ongoing conversations about land, heritage, and protection. So where does that leave the old story? The one about a mysterious civilization that built astonishing cities in the desert and then simply ceased to exist. It leaves it dead, or at least it should. The Ancestral Puebloans, once mislabeled the Anasazi by people who were never their own, did not vanish from Chaco Canyon. They walked out of it, carrying their traditions, their genetic lineage, and eventually their turkeys, into new valleys along the Rio. Grande, where their direct descendants still live today, still hold ceremonies and structures like the roundhouse at Picuri's, used for centuries by summer and winter ritual societies, and still, as of April 2025, hold in their own bloodline scientifically confirmed, peer-reviewed proof that the empire of stone and stars built at Chaco Canyon never actually ended. It just moved. It just kept living. And for the first time in the history of American archaeology, the people who always knew that got to prove it on their own terms, using their own DNA, controlling their own data and putting their own names, not a borrowed label from a rival nation, on a discovery that rewrites what an entire continent thought it understood about a civilization it had already wrongly buried. There's a quiet irony worth sitting with here. It took some of the most advanced genetic sequencing technology on the planet, processed in a climate-controlled clean lab thousands of miles away in Copenhagen, to scientifically confirm something a community of 300 people in a New Mexico valley had already known, generation after generation, without needing a single machine to tell them. The science didn't discover the truth. It arrived 5 centuries late to finally get the paperwork right. And the next time someone tells you an ancient civilization simply vanished without a trace, it might be worth asking a different question first. Vanished according to whom? And has anyone actually bothered to ask the people who are still there, still living on that same land, still telling that same story, still waiting patiently for the rest of the wider outside world to finally, truly, honestly catch up completely?